Okay, so do you ever wonder what the hell happened to Carson Wentz? And you know, after seeing Carson Wentz go week after week without even being offered a single contract, I thought it was time to look back at the sad career of Carson Wentz. So without further ado, let's get right into the tragedy that was Carson Wentz's NFL career. What happens when a man reaches rock bottom? Well, as it sits right now, Carson Wentz is there, as he technically has no job and his time as a starting quarterback in the NFL looks all but over. So to understand how Carson found himself at the lowest point he could possibly be at, we gotta go all the way back. April 28th. 2016, the day it all began. The 2016 NFL Draft had just gotten underway, and after acquiring the number 2 overall pick from the welfare-dependent Browns a week prior, the Philadelphia Eagles were ready to prove to the NFL this haul was worth it, as they would select Carson James Wentz 2nd overall, ringing in a brand new era in Philadelphia. At this point, a new era was desperately needed in Philly, as just a year prior, the Eagles shipped off Nick Foles, more on him later, to the Rams in exchange for Sam Bradford, hoping the man made of cardboard could be the savior of Philadelphia. But that plan didn't work out even a little bit, as the Eagles went 7-7 under Bradford for the games he actually played in, then lost another 2 with Mark Sanchez, which of course led to the firing of their disaster artist head coach in Chip Kelly. So now with an empty seat, who would be the leader of men for Philadelphia in the future? On January 14th, 2016, the Eagles announced they would be hiring Andy Reid disciple Doug Peterson to be their 23rd head coach in franchise history. And along with Carson Wentz, these two would change everything for the city of Philadelphia. So the dynamic duo of Doug Peterson and Carson Wentz had been formed, and once they got to work, immediately things started looking very promising for Philly. Sort of. I mean, after a few unexpected setbacks during training camp, things went smoothly for Carson Wentz, as reports and eyewitnesses claimed Carson was developing faster than anyone could have predicted, but he still wasn't ready to start come week 1 of the 2016 season, as Sam Bradford was supposed to continue to mentor the young ginger. And throughout the preseason, if anything, this plan was only reinforced, with Carson Wentz going down in a preseason game early, so I mean, there's no way the Eagles would willingly put out an injured quarterback in week 1, right? I mean, that would just be outrageous and idiotic on every conceivable, well, just days before the season began. Meanwhile, up north, Teddy Bridgewater at the time, a Viking, was attacked by a rogue pigeon and was now out for the year. So to take full advantage of a desperate franchise, the Eagles traded Sam Bradford to the Vikings, leaving Carson Wentz and, I guess, Chase Daniels all alone in the quarterback room. Now Carson Wentz was forced into action way earlier than anyone, including himself, could have possibly thought, as he was set to face the Cleveland Browns as the starting quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles in just week 1. And how did it go? Well, I'm not gonna lie, it went pretty damn well.
End zone.
Are you buying Carson Wentz as an elite quarterback, Nick?
I am buying Carson Wentz.
Through his first 3 games, Carson Wentz incinerated the NFL with his arm talent and put the entire league on notice when in week 3, Carson Wentz obliterated the Pittsburgh Steelers 34-3 as Wentz outplayed future Hall of Famer and general good guy Ben Roethlisberger in every facet of the game. Carson's stats were also on a whole nother level through this small sample size, as he dropped a total of 769 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions through 3 games. And comparing him to the last 2 historic Offensive Rookie of the Year quarterback winners, Carson Wentz was right there, leading his Eagles to an undefeated record, something the other 2 guys here failed to accomplish. Carson Wentz was breaking a new quarterback record pretty much every other week, to the point where the public and Eagles fans alike were just getting used to this. So with all of this unprecedented success, there was one question on everyone's mind. Could Carson Wentz somehow keep this up and continue on his historic trajectory? Well, although he wasn't bad per se, the answer to that question is no. No, he couldn't. Although he didn't slow down his volume whatsoever, the law of averages set in as Carson began throwing a little more passes to the other team, but still looked very comfortable out there, especially for a rookie who was never even supposed to play. So although the Eagles had fallen off a little bit since their 3-0 start, they still had a shot to do something in the playoffs, as going into a Week 11 game against what was left of the Seahawks Legion of Boom unit, they had a prime chance to stake their claim as a real threat in the NFC. So the Eagles would take on the Seahawks, and after this game, a historic landslide would unfortunately take place. The Eagles would experience a 5-game stretch of pure misery, and Philadelphia would promptly be eliminated from the playoffs, and Carson Wentz's impressive rookie season was over just like that. But through these 13 games, Carson Wentz finished the 2016 season still showing a ton of promise for the future, as although he had regressed significantly from that godly 3-game stretch, averaging 231.8 yards per game, not even a touchdown, and now over an interception. But still, these numbers were nothing to worry about. But although his numbers may appear pedestrian, pretty much everyone in the Eagles locker room believed in Carson Wentz and said that he basically had that it factor, something you just can't teach. And it also helped Carson's case that throughout his rookie season, we got some very interesting insight into how he prepares in between games, as Doug Peterson described Carson Wentz's film sessions and pregame preparation rituals as Peyton Manning-esque, which is pretty much the highest possible praise a young quarterback can get. So although obviously with Carson Wentz the future was looking very bright, but nobody, and I mean nobody, could have possibly predicted what the 2017 NFL season had in store for Philly.
Carson Wentz is the MVP.
Torn ACL, it appears, yes.
For the Philadelphia Eagles, the long drought is over.
But first, we had the 2017 offseason to get through, and the Eagles got busy making sure Carson Wentz had all the weapons he possibly needed, as they added LeGarrette Blount and way later Jay Ajayi at running back, as well as Alshon Jeffrey and Torrey Smith at receiver. And add that onto the fact that Lane Johnson, arguably the best right tackle in football, was set to be eligible to return for the entire 2017 season after a suspension, and it looked like Carson Wentz had upgraded his cooker from a microwave to a gas-powered grill. Add all of these new shiny toys at Carson Wentz's disposal onto the fact that we had just been bombarded with constant reports about Carson's unprecedented work ethic, and Eagles fans just couldn't wait for the season to start. Oh, the Eagles also brought Nick Foles back, just, you know, something I thought I'd mention. Probably won't matter though. So with that, the 2017 NFL season would begin, and for Eagles fans, I think the season started off a little slower than they would have liked. Throughout the first couple of weeks, the Eagles hovered around the league as nothing more than a middle-of-the-pack team, but eventually, in just a few weeks, that would all change. In Week 3, with the threat of going 1-2 as a very real possibility, Carson Wentz and the Eagles were locked in a dangerous duel with the New York Giants. After a poor punt by the Giants, Carson Wentz froze Eli Apple on a fake read and found Alshon Jeffrey for a 19-yard completion, giving the Eagles a chance. Holding his massive schlong with two hands, Doug Peterson sent out the Eagles' rookie kicker Jake Elliott to attempt a 61-yard field goal to win the game, and he made it. So if you want one takeaway from this Eagles win, this team had one massive pair on them. And instead of one flash-in-the-pan moment, this Jake Elliott field goal would effectively be the spark that would ignite the 2017 Eagles. In Week 5 of the still very early 2017 season, Carson Wentz exploded on the poor Cardinals for 300 yards and 4 touchdowns as the Eagles finally started getting the respect that they deserved. Then, just 1 week after that, the Panthers would be the next victim to Carson Wentz's blade, as the Eagles had moved to 5-1 and were straight up strangling their prey to death over this period of time. During this 6-game stretch, Carson Wentz was the conductor to the most efficient offense in the league, and according to this graphic done by the one and only Brett Coleman, it wasn't even close either, as not a single defense that had challenged the Eagles had come even close to throwing Carson Wentz off of his historically great season thus far. But we've already seen this before with Carson Wentz, where he'll have a small stretch of games of just beyond elite play only to come crashing back down to reality. Except this time, something different would happen.
Wentz to the end zone, touchdown! Steps and throws, touchdown!
But to me, the NFL MVP right now is Carson Wentz.
Carson Wentz was simply a different breed. Through this next 5-game stretch, Carson was rarely even in close games, as the Eagles destroyed most teams they played in the first half, but that didn't stop him from dropping an admittedly pedestrian 214 yards per game, but 3 touchdowns per game on the dot and barely an interception. It's crazy to think back on now, but at one point, Carson Wentz was the textbook definition of an MVP level quarterback who specialized in overwhelming efficiency. But for all of his success, Carson Wentz and the Eagles still had their doubters, and luckily for both parties, ahead of the Eagles were probably their 2 hardest tests of the season, with a Week 13 showdown at Seattle and the following week at the ghost town of the Los Angeles Rams. These games were important for a variety of reasons, but from a narrative standpoint, although Carson Wentz had a healthy grasp on the MVP, both Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson and Rams running back Todd Gurley had been trailing Carson all year long, and finally had a chance to derail the all but inevitable MVP. It's Week 13, and the day had come. Primetime Sunday Night Football. Russell Wilson versus Carson Wentz, a matchup that everyone had marked on their calendar. And as the two duked it out, the result wasn't great, as remember, Russell Wilson in a Seahawks jersey in December might have been the coldest player in NFL history, so his performance was expected. But for the first time, Carson Wentz looked at least a little bit stifled, as although he had a good game overall, at points when it mattered, the Seahawks were able to clamp Carson up, which led to the Eagles continuing to push further into this all-or-nothing ideology, going for 4 fourth downs in this game opposed to the Seahawks 0. So, the Eagles lost, but this game was chalked up as more of a defensive woe than a Carson Wentz problem, and unfortunately, in some version of Twisted Fate, this narrative would later be confirmed, as in just the next week, the second test would come up for Carson Wentz, as they would travel to the Los Angeles Rams Stadium in Week 14. This game had a ton of baggage behind it, as on top of the far-fetched Todd Gurley for MVP thing that was going on, this was the first ever NFL battle of the top 2 picks of the 2016 NFL Draft, so fireworks were expected, and I guess fireworks were delivered, just, you know, more in a Jason Pierre-Paul kind of way. Immediately, the Rams went down the field and got a Todd Gurley touchdown, and after one singular fan said Todd Gurley for MVP or something like that, Carson Wentz unleashed pure rage on the Rams, scoring 3 easy touchdowns on 3 straight drives, slicing through one of the best defenses in the league like Greg Hardy through his ex-girlfriend. He was just scorching the Rams all day, but I believe one singular play from this game basically just summed up what 2017 Carson Wentz was in a nutshell. With a 3rd and 11 on their own 30, a first down would have been nice here, but with only a minute and 24 on the clock, it would be more logical to try and make the Rams burn a timeout and make their next drive a little bit more difficult. Instead, Doug Peterson had a pulley installed to hold his magnum dong and trusted everything in his MVP quarterback. And with the entire pocket crumbling around him, Carson's just chilling in the cluttered pocket and through some miracle finds Torrey Smith to set up a free field goal. But even with Carson playing out of his mind, the Rams crawled back into the game, meaning Carson Wentz went straight back to work, going right down the field where the Eagles found themselves in a 1st and goal situation on the 3-yard line. The following clip may not be suitable for children, and Eagles fans, I'm sorry.
Wentz to his right. Flag is down, and Wentz in for the touchdown.
just like that, it was over. Everything that Carson Wentz had been building all season long just came crumbling down on one singular play, and the Eagles in just a few milliseconds went from a Super Bowl favorite to just an underdog. And although Nicholas Extensive Richard Foles would come in and rally the Eagles to a much needed win over the Rams, it didn't really matter to Eagles fans and NFL fans alike, as after the game, we got the most devastating, worst case scenario news. Carson Wentz was done for the season. His MRI done one day after the game revealed Carson had torn his ACL, arguably the worst injury in sports, and outside of the obvious blow to Carson's physical health, meanwhile the Eagles as a football team had just lost possibly the best player in the league to injury, meaning their season was all but over as well. But no, it just couldn't have been that easy now, could it? So with Carson 6 feet under, the first seeded Eagles had a new quarterback, as Nick Foles was now the commander of this fearsome unit. Except Foles might have been the best possible backup the Eagles could have had, as he had previous success with the Eagles a few years back, and with a few tweaks to the playbook, they could at least have Nick Foles appear as a competent game manager while Carson watched from the sidelines in horror. From Carson's perspective, the 3 starts that Nick Foles logged after his injury seemed to verify that Wentz was in fact the engine that made this Eagles team run, as the Nick Foles experience was a whole different roller coaster for the Eagles to get used to. Literally, in Nick Foles' first start against the Giants, he played the best game an Eagle had played all year, dropping an efficient 237 yards and 4 touchdowns, leading the Eagles to a massive win. But then just one game later against the Raiders, Nick Foles couldn't even complete anything past 4 yards, throwing for an astonishingly inefficient 163 yards with 1 touchdown and an interception. So safe to say, Nick Foles was not Carson Wentz. But with the regular season ending, the Eagles were still the first seed in the NFC, even with nobody giving them a chance to even get out of the first round. And meanwhile, with Carson Wentz missing the final few games of the season, of course, Thomas Edward Patrick Brady Jr. got his grubby old hands on the MVP trophy. The first gut punch straight into Carson Wentz's ego. So with that, the Eagles would go into their first playoff game at home as the number 1 seed hosting the 6th-seeded Atlanta Falcons. And despite the overwhelming seeding difference, the Falcons, led by Matt Ryan and Julio Jones, were still 3-point favorites, primarily because of how far they had gone in the playoffs just 1 year prior. So the game began, and immediately it seemed like these were going to be the 2 best teams the NFC had to offer. The Eagles were hungry and took an early lead, but the Falcons' experience helped them battle back, and for the entire second half, it was a defensive stalemate with a grand total of 0 touchdowns scored by either team. Then the final drive happened, and Matt Ryan, a guy who was a sensei in the art of the 2-minute drill, went right down the field with ease. But after 3 failed attempts on the Philadelphia 9-yard line, it all came down to one final play. So with the season on the line, I gotta ask, what play call do you think the Falcons decided to draw up? Well, you know, just the average red zone play. They started by flanking their deaf fullback out to the left, then made sure Matt Ryan was in his comfort zone by pushing him out of the pocket immediately, and then decided to force a ball to Julio Jones, who was never even open. Good work, Falcons. Nice job. So with that, the Eagles were unexpectedly moving on to the NFC Championship to play the Vikings with Nick Foles as their quarterback still. Once more, the Vikings were 3-point favorites in this game, and it's not even worth talking about. This game was just so embarrassing for the Vikings. Nick Foles must have borrowed Carson Wentz's soul, because he played out of his mind. I mean, these are stats by Nick Foles, not like a prime Peyton Manning. No. Nick Foles. So throughout all of these impossible obstacles to overcome, the Philadelphia Eagles would meet the evil empire in the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl, and everyone was rightfully beyond excited. Everyone except for one particular quarterback. Although we didn't know it at the time, the surprising playoff success of this Eagles team really took a huge toll on Carson Wentz's confidence, and reports much later on would go on to reveal that in a very selfish way, Carson Wentz had serious issues with the accomplishments that the Eagles were racking up without him. But this mental problem by Carson Wentz shouldn't even be possible, as long as the Eagles don't just beat the Patriots in the Super Bowl, and then people will go back to saying, oh, if the Eagles had a healthy Carson Wentz, this would have been a whole different game. Well, that didn't exactly happen.
Brady gets hit, the ball is out!
Just another game, right, Nick?
Yeah, just another game.
In one of the greatest upsets in Super Bowl history, Nick Foles conquered the New England Patriots dynasty, having the game of his life, somehow overshadowing an even better performance by Thomas. I mean, Tom threw for 500 yards and 3 touchdowns, and nobody talks about his performance at all. And on top of that, this man, Nick Foles, now owns one of the most iconic plays in NFL history as the Eagles whipped out the Philly special, which somehow worked perfectly as Nick Foles caught a touchdown. And this one play call was enough to get a statue outside the goddamn stadium. So now every time Carson Wentz had to go clock in for work, he had to see a statue of the man who stole his moment. So with a Super Bowl win, Nick Foles had just taken all the confidence Carson Wentz had in himself, crumpled it into a ball, and crushed it under the girth of his super chode, as Foles, not Wentz, was now hailed as the savior of Philadelphia. So, going into the 2018 season, after Carson Wentz did all he could, becoming almost unanimously the most valuable player in the NFL, he now had to deal with ridiculous discussions as to who the Eagles quarterback should be in 2018. Now, the Eagles made it clear there was no quarterback controversy here at all, and when healthy, Carson Wentz would be the guy. But to start the season, he would still be going through rehab. So after 2 games of Nick Foles to start the season, the Eagles went back to Carson Wentz, and he would start in a Week 3 game against the Indianapolis Colts. In his first game since his ACL tear, Carson Wentz looked solid enough, definitely had some rust to knock off, but still had fleeting moments where he looked like the Carson Wentz of old, posting a solid enough stat line in the process. And sure enough, over his next 5 games, more and more rust just kept getting scraped off, and over this stretch of time, Carson got to the point where he was averaging an extremely efficient 300.4 yards per game, 2 touchdowns, and only threw a single interception during this time period. And although the Eagles only went 2-3, Philadelphia fans could take a deep breath knowing they still had a franchise quarterback. And best of all, it looked like that mobility and it factor that made Carson Wentz was back and better than ever. But that's the thing with Carson Wentz. Just when he started to get into a small groove, when the tides of success shifted in his favor for a fleeting second, it's almost as if some greater power simply would not allow Carson Wentz to come anywhere near the sky-high potential he should have been destined to fulfill. And it all began once more before a Week 7 game against the Panthers, as Carson Wentz had mysteriously been added to the injury report with a supposed back injury sustained a week prior. The problem here is that Carson Wentz had sustained a stress fracture in his back in college, so to see this injury flare back up was just about the last thing the Eagles and Carson Wentz wanted to see happen. But for now, that back injury was brushed to the side as Carson kept playing, acting like nothing was wrong. But his stats said otherwise, as not only were his statistics down across the board, but Carson Wentz was beginning to have his character questioned for the first time in his career. career, and reports were beginning to emerge that he was slowly losing the locker room. Straight after a week where the Eagles barely escaped the Giants, an anonymous Eagles player went to a reporter and basically said Carson Wentz was killing the team chemistry by forcing the ball to his homeboy Zach Ertz, and pretty much every player on offense was getting a little fed up. So with Carson Wentz beginning to regress, as well as the locker room starting to get pissed about the supposedly biased target share, things got even worse when out of nowhere after their Week 14 game against the Dallas Cowboys, a bombshell was dropped that Carson's previous back injury was way more serious than anyone thought, and the Eagles ruled Carson as out for the season for the second year in a row. So with the Eagles once more losing their franchise quarterback for the season, the players did what any normal player would do when you lose your best player. You can't make this up. Instead of, caring even a little bit about the man who had just temporarily lost his job, they built a goddamn shrine in the locker room dedicated to the one and only Nick Foles. So here we are once again. The Eagles started a playoff run for the second year in a row without their franchise quarterback, and again, the Eagles had their playoff matchup in which they were the heavy 6.5-point underdogs, this time against the powerhouse Chicago Bears on the road. There was no way that Nick Foles' magic would find a way this time against a Bears defense led by Khalil Mack and others, and for most of the game, it looked like the Eagles would finally fall. Down by 5 with minutes left in the fourth quarter, Nick Foles was calm and collected and led the Eagles straight down the ice-cold Soldier Field and found newly acquired wide receiver Golden Tate for a massive touchdown. Now the Bears had the ball back, and although I can't tell you with 100% certainty what Carson Wentz wanted to happen with this last drive, what did happen was definitely not great towards his mental health. You know the drill, the Bears find themselves in field goal range, and Nick Foles would be moving on in the playoffs, and this time he would face the Super Bowl favorites in the New Orleans Saints, led by a hungry Drew Brees. So there was no shot that Nicholas Foles could pull this one off. Sadly for everyone except for Carson Wentz, he wasn't able to. But if Alshon Jeffrey didn't drop this routine slant, then maybe things would be different. But for Carson Wentz and his interesting motivations, this seemed like a great opportunity, as the 2019 season would start, and once again, he was ready to prove that his team needed him to win football games. As the offseason began, Carson Wentz was given the best possible news he could have heard, as the man who had indirectly tortured him over and over again had finally left, as Nick Foles took his talents to the Jacksonville Jaguars, not being able to resist a wild 4-year, $88 million deal to go live in Duval. And to make it very clear that Carson was still the guy in Philly, the front office turned around and handed Carson Wentz a brand new shiny 4-year, $128 million contract with $107 million guaranteed, basically locking up Carson Wentz for the rest of his good years in the NFL. So with Nick Foles off, this left Carson Wentz as the only competent quarterback on the roster going into 2019, and throughout this whole process, Carson Wentz unfortunately just kept losing more and more people in the locker room. Regardless, entering week 1 of the 2019 NFL season, Carson Wentz was healthy for the first time in years. His back was feeling great, and he went out in his first game and delivered a vintage Carson Wentz performance, throwing for an efficient 313 yards and 3 touchdowns as the Eagles narrowly took down Washington. But this early success wouldn't last long, and Carson's biggest strengths in the past would turn out to be his biggest problems of the present, as previously, Carson Wentz used to be able to miraculously escape sacks and find a man down the field. but now in a much more broken down body, Carson just couldn't move like he used to. So these hero ball plays that he was once known for now serve to his detriment. And you know, Carson just couldn't catch a break either, as after a Week 6 game where the Eagles got blown out by the Vikings, for the second time, an Eagles player anonymously went to the same reporter as last time, where it was said that Carson needs to stop trying to make something out of nothing on every play and just check it down more often. Now, although Carson Wentz wasn't exactly the hero of this story, his teammates weren't being too supportive of him either. But both sides agreed to disagree, and after a few weeks where the Eagles' playoff hopes were looking grim, the team started to catch fire. Led by their star quarterback, the Eagles miraculously reeled off 4 wins straight to end the season, as Carson looked like his old self and then some, dropping nearly 300 yards per game, almost 2 touchdowns, and not even a single interception, as he would finally get to play in his first ever playoff game. Finally, after years of carrying the load during the regular season, only to watch as Nick Foles bared the fruits of his labor during the postseason, Carson Wentz would come into the postseason at 100% health. And when asked how he felt about the playoff game he was going to start in, the man just said he was excited and grateful to be healthy and on the field. After just 4 passes attempted in his first ever playoff game, after just 1 drive, Carson Wentz got hit from behind by a wild Jadeveon Clowney, and after 1 awkward hit, all the life was sucked out of the stadium. Carson Wentz was devastated. The one opportunity he had finally been given was taken away from him by factors outside of his control, and although he fought to try to get back in the game, the man could barely figure out where he was, and he was ruled out for the remainder of the playoff game with a concussion. This forced a 40-year-old Josh McCown to take the field with his #1 receiver as Greg Ward, and safe to say, the game did not go well. So the Eagles had lost again, and be it his fault or not, a dark reality was starting to set in for Carson Wentz. He just couldn't avoid injury, and the Eagles realized this, deciding to use a 2nd-round draft pick on Alabama quarterback Jalen Hurts, basically buying some insurance in case Carson Wentz's development started to regress. And early on, Carson Wentz didn't seem overly enthusiastic about the Jalen Hurts selection, and subsequently wasn't super eager to reach out and help the young guy develop behind him. But I guess that was understandable. Also, COVID stuff had started going on, so connecting with players was getting harder, and it really looked like players had begun to respect Carson Wentz as a leader and a man. As long as he went on the gridiron and laid everything out on the field and produced, then no problems would arise whatsoever. With all of these positive reports coming out of camp, the 2020 season looked like it was going to be a bounce back year for Carson Wentz, and just maybe he could go back to his MVP form that now feels like it was so long ago. Well, that didn't happen.
The problem's not the team, the problem's the quarterback.
Wentz is third down pass is picked. Wentz loud enough there for Jeffrey.
Carson Wentz has been awful this year.
This 2020 campaign would be the greatest tragedy of Carson Wentz's career to date, as through just the 11 full games he played in, Carson Wentz averaged 231 yards per game while damn near leading the league in pass attempts, and his efficiency, which he was once praised for, had now regressed to the point where he was almost throwing more interceptions than touchdowns. So this begs to ask the question, what happened? The 2020 season was really just a perfect storm of a disaster for Carson Wentz, as his body just couldn't move like how it used to even just last year. And add that onto the fact that his confidence had been shot for a few seasons now, and the front office seemed to have lost faith in him already as well as his coach, and it seemed like Carson Wentz was effectively set up to fail. But Carson's biggest problem was never contained, and it kept spiraling out of control. He just couldn't stop playing hero ball, even when it was killing his team. And then it happened. On December 6th of 2020, the Eagles did the unthinkable and benched Carson Wentz in the middle of a Week 13 game against the Packers, all but ending the Carson Wentz era in Philadelphia. At this point, there was no going back, and the Eagles were all in on cleaning house as they shipped Carson Wentz and his monstrous contract off to the Colts and did the same with their Super Bowl winning head coach, forcing Doug Peterson to walk the plank after a tumultuous 5 seasons with the team. So just like that, it was over. Carson Wentz, the man who was drafted 2nd overall and dubbed the savior of Philadelphia, was out after barely logging a single healthy season and never finished a single playoff game in his entire career. But maybe a fresh start was exactly what Carson Wentz needed, and it was still apparent that he had the arm talent at least, so maybe a situation like Jim Plunkett's was still mildly plausible. So he was on the Colts now, and after a little hiccup with some vaccination stuff, Colts coaches and players had been very impressed with Carson Wentz's play during training camp and practices, and he looked like he had worked himself back into football shape faster than anyone could have possibly expected. So there was no question Carson Wentz would be the starting quarterback, and as the 2021 season began, early on it seemed as if we were getting a whole new version of Carson Wentz. Rather than the Superman he tried to be, Carson had evolved into a game manager, as his stats were down across the board, but at the very least, he was doing what was asked of him, and if he could keep this play up, there will be a spot for him in the league for a long, long time. And you know, I really wish I could have just ended it there and said that, oh, Carson Wentz had a great season being a solid game manager, but no. There's just a bone in Carson Wentz's body that straight up refuses to just let plays die. I don't want to go through all of them, but so many times throughout this 2021 campaign, Carson Wentz would look great in a game, making laser throws into tight coverage while looking as poised as ever in the pocket, only to turn around and throw one of the worst passes you'll ever see, like switching hands or doing some other outlandish crap. But I guess Carson Wentz played solid enough and rode Jonathan Taylor to an almost all but locked up playoff spot in 2021. All the Colts had to do was win one of their last 2 games and they were in the playoffs. So ahead of a Week 17 game against the Raiders, who also needed every win they could get, the football gods saw that Carson Wentz had a chance to play in the playoffs, and of course, he got hit with a case of the COVID before the game. But Carson Wentz was not going to be held out of this game, as he was able to clear himself before, but didn't look like the same player whatsoever during the actual affair, as his only touchdown came off of whatever the hell this throw was, and the Raiders ended up taking down Carson Wentz and the Colts. So although this loss did suck, all the Colts needed was one more win over their Week 18 opponent in the worst team in football, in the Jacksonville Jaguars. And now Carson Wentz was healthy, so for the first time in his career, he decided his own fate. And, well, he blew it. Carson Wentz and the entire Colts team just folded under the pressure. From the very first snap, the Jaguars dismantled the Colts, ending the game in pretty much the first quarter alone, with Carson Wentz playing like trash along with the rest of the team. So somehow the Colts missed the playoffs, and led by Carson Wentz, had just suffered their franchise's most embarrassing regular season loss ever. And unfortunately, this season marked the end of Carson Wentz as a respectable NFL player. People had now 100% given up on him being anything more than a below-average starter, and the Colts knew this as well, as after just 1 season, they kicked him to the curb, trading him for a conditional 3rd-round pick to the Commanders. And in Washington, it was more of the same for Carson Wentz. He showed flashes of that elite talent he once had, only to make some awful decisions that averaged everything out. And very early on in the season, when he was probably going to get benched anyways, he made the decision for the coaches and he got hurt once more. Then when Carson Wentz returned from his injury, he came back and played the worst football of his career, dropping a ghastly masterpiece against the Browns, throwing 3 interceptions while disintegrating Washington's playoff hopes in the process. Which leaves us to today. As of May 6th, 2023, Carson Wentz is not signed to an NFL team, and he'll probably stick around in the league as a backup for a few years, but maybe there's a chance Carson Wentz has just had enough at this point. I mean, as we've just gone over, he's gone through a lot. So from a guy who was once arguably the best player in the league, time and time again, everything that could go wrong for him did. And with injuries continuing to stockpile, the Carson Wentz we see today is nothing like the young, bright man we watched take over the NFL so long ago. And we may have just seen the last of Carson Wentz as we know him. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, then tell me in the comments, because I still want to know if you guys are liking these longer form videos. And if you like this video, then watch this video right here where I went over all the quarterbacks who came after Peyton Manning. It's pretty good, trust me. Anyways, until next time.